So good day, and we'll continue on looking at the different plant groups for the class. And today we get to look at a very unusual plant group that is going to be primarily native to the Americas. And it's an iconic plant of some of the desert or the dry areas in Americas. And so we get to see uh, a plant group that has not flowers that are not going to be too sophisticated. So when we compare them to our generic drawing of the flower, so we have the stamens, we have the petals, we have the stigma, the style, and the reproductive structure, as well as the ovary. And so this is the flower on the right side of a typical asparagus, because the family that we are going to be looking at is going to be a section of the Asparagaceae, or the asparagus family. And so that's what we're going to be concentrating on. The Asparagaceae, or the asparagus family, it's a relatively new family. With the new work on genetic, they have made it a lot bigger. So in the old days, many of the plants, including the Agavoides, which is now a subfamily, were a family of their own, but through all this new work, they have been placed under Agave, Asparagaceae. And so that is one that is very big now compared to the others. But we're not going to see the entire family of Asparagaceae. We're just going to concentrate on the agaves, or the subfamily Agavoides, because that's going to be one that is going to be popular for ornamental value. But within the Agavoides, we have the Brodioides, which is going to be Brodia, a bulb plant or a geophyte plant that is native to California. The representative here is the wild hyacinth. And there's going to be many more plants, so a geophyte. And then we have the Coelioides, subfamily Coelioides, which is going to be represented by the Ornithogallum, or they call them Star of Bethlehem, and a few others. And then we have the Lomandroides, which is going to be known by the type specimen Lomandra, which is native to Australia. And then within the Asparagoides, there's one family that kind of branch, or some a plant group that branch. We have the Asparagoides, or the asparagus-like. So that's where the asparagus will fall into. And then we have the Nolioides, Nolina, or that elephant foot. And in this case, we have the Ruscus, or the butcher's broom. So these are all related, coming from one ancestor, and the last two just branch from an even closer ancestor. So the lineage is even closer. So we are going to concentrate on just the Agavoides and the members of that family group, which are going to be common in ornamental. So Agavoides, and we're just going to say the Agave family, even though it's not a family. It is a subfamily. It's going to be the Agave genus is going to be primarily to America, so it's going to be another almost exclusive American plant family, plant group. The other members will be spread throughout the other areas. And so when we look at just this family, it's a monocot, so they're all going to be strap-like leaves, or palm-like leaves. We have 23 genera and about 637 species. So the subfamily is going to be a little bit small, which is good, because then you can definitely get to know the different members. And just here's a image of them, members used in the landscape. So we have Nolina, and then we have Agave. And I'm going to mention aloe right here, because aloe is going to be a plant that may look very similar to agaves, and often it is confused. However, aloes have its own family group, and aloes are mainly going to be native to Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. So they look the same because they evolve in similar areas, similar environmental areas, similar niches. And so they both were filling their niche in the environment, one in Americas, one in Africa and Europe. or Middle East. And so just be aware that aloes and agaves may look similar, but they are not. And here's a typical agave rosette. And rosette, we're going to talk about the leaf when they are clasping and forming a round flower-like. So the leaves are going to be important in guiding the water to the roots or to the area where the plant can then absorb not just water, but mist that will eventually collect into water droplets will be guided into the roots. And then we have here a few others genera within this subfamily group. We have chlorogalum or chlorogalum. It's known as soap lily. Here, California native. So here was growing in the wild in San Luis Obispo. So it has very similar flowers, not too sophisticated in this case. And here's the chlorogalum that would have been native to Southern California. The photographs here from Griffith Park. In this case, the flowers are going to be pollinated by nocturnal insects or animals. And so by about 5 or 6 p.m. in the afternoon or in the early evening is when the flowers will open to receive the visit from their pollinators. And so here's the flowers for that genus. And then we have chlorophyton, which is the spider plant, very popular in the ornamental trade with the flowers that look very similar and not too sophisticated. Here's a few other species. Or we have a hosta, another very popular plant for a shade environment or shade landscape. With the flowers that not look like a little tubular, so now there's more sophistication, probably pollinated by a moth in the wild. And then we have cordyline here with hundreds of flowers, very small and very similar because they are related. And here's a pink one, the cordyline indivisa or cordyline, the tea plant, uh, terminalis. So there's the flowers for these individuals. You can see them a little bit better. Or Hesperali, which is the red yucca that is also becoming very popular or has become very popular in ornamental landscapes for the ability to tolerate drought. And so here it is used in the landscape. Or the Veschosia, which is also known as Yucca. So here it is growing different Fullerton Arboretum, and here it is in San Luis Obispo with these flowers that are going to be now probably pollinated by hummingbirds. And so here's the flowers. And then we have Fucrea, which is sometimes known as Cuban hemp. It is a tropical agave member of this subfamily. And so it is native to the South America and into the Caribbeans. And here it is where it can develop a very large stem or a very tall stem. So it will flower eventually. And we also want to mention that many of them, or many members of this family, are going to be what they refer to as monocarpic, which means that once they flower, such as this specimen here that was flowering in Brazil, then they'll die. And so we have a very large flower stalk. We have the leaves that are now drooping, which means it's dying. So it's only has one more job, and that is to get pollinated, fertilized, get the fruit, the seeds, and then disperse those. And here they are growing in the LA County Arboretum. So you can see them for scale. And then we have the Hesperoyaca, which is a California native, very common to see along the hills, the foothills, and sometimes into the coastal areas. So it's dispersed. It is becoming very popular in ornamental. So here it is when it's beginning to flower. So it's also monocarpic. So once it flowers, it will also die. So here it is in Griffith Park. And what's very interesting with this yucca is that it has a very special relationship with a moth. So here it is in San Luis Obispo, and that's where I saw the moth for the first time. And here's the flowers with several flies just taking advantage. But here's a real moth. It is a yucca moth. And the yucca moth, it's the main pollinator, or it should be the only pollinator for this flower. And so what happens is that the moth is going to pick up pollen from a flower where uh, it may have been hatched or lived on, and it's going to carry it with it. When the moth then finds a flower that is at the right time, it's going to lay the eggs or her eggs in the ovary and into the different ovules of the flower. And that's probably what this one is doing right now. Once she finishes laying her eggs, then she's going to deliberately pollinate the flower. And so, as the seeds mature and develop, the seeds will feed the developing larva young inside the ovary. Yes, there is going to be a sacrifice made by the plant in sacrificing a few of its offsprings, but that is the only way that this plant can ensure that it gets pollinated, deliberately pollination by an insect. And so it's a give and take, it's a mutual relationship. Both individual benefit, the plant by having a pollinator and the moth by having food for its young. But this is a very interesting relationship. And if you're ever out hiking and you see these plants, pay close attention because the moths are probably going to be there hiding. Obviously, they don't want to be seen. And it's very unusual to see them, but they're there. And so here's a close up of it. So this is the yucca moth or yucca moth with its rightful plant, which is the yucca, chaparral yucca that we have around here. And so then we have different types of yuccas that are going to be native throughout the Americas. So here is one of the largest ones that is found here at Rancho Los Alamitos. And there's the yucca, the California native Joshua tree. There is a big national park protected plant in the desert. And here's Yucca guatemalensis, one of the big ones from South America that is being grown here in Southern California. And so here's just a few others. Soapweed yucca, found in different botanic gardens throughout Southern California and or in the landscapes throughout the area. And so here's the flowers that look very similar to the Hesper yucca or the others. And here they are growing at our campus or flowering at a campus. And they are going to be very nice if you ever get a chance to grow them. And then if we now focus on just the agaves, which is going to be the more popular one. So here's some tropical agaves. So don't think just agaves as being in the desert area, but many of them will come from tropical areas or climates. So here they are in Chiapas, growing on the cliffs and just out of the rocks, very, very happily. And here's where they have companions with other plants and just here growing on the ground with other shrubs. So here's an understory. So there is a pine forest above them and just growing in some kind of dapple shade, and they're very happy. And here they are in the landscape. Some of them are going to be selections for having some kind of variegation. So here's the blue agave. You can see the reverts form coming out of the roots, but the ones that were planted had a variegation or a white stripe in the middle. And so here's the native agave shawi, and this would be the agave that you would find in the coastal area. So if there was a California coastal agave, it's agave shawi. Now, it's native to Baja California, and it did made a natural distribution into the San Diego County just north of the border. But unfortunately, the only known population in San Diego was in the way of the wall. And so, in order for them to build a wall, they had to extirpate the plant, put it in cultivation, and they built a wall. So, the only known population was destroyed already. And just here's an assortment of different agaves. This one in Oaxaca, with some of them flowering and a couple of other yuccas in the background. So here's the agaves that we have, and just an assortment of agaves here. Many the ones in the background have flowers, so now they're dead, and the ones that are flowering towards the left will die eventually. So for us, it's an average of about 6 to 8 years. Agaves have a common name of century plant because when grown in Europe or in a conservatory or in areas where it gets cold, obviously with protection from frost, it'll take many years. They were saying 70 years, 100 years, and that's where the common name century or century plant came about. And so here's some of the agaves when they are in full flower. And here's the close-up of some of those. This is Agave biomoriana growing at the Fullerton Arboretum and flowering at the Fullerton Arboretum. Here's at the LA County Arboretum, also with Agave biomoriana. I think the common name is octopus agave. And there's the beautiful flowers. And I mentioned conservatories. So if you ever get a chance to go to England, this is Kew Botanic Gardens. This is their exotic plant display. American plants in England and other parts of the world are going to be very exotic because it gets too cold, and some of these are from drier climate. And here's a very large one in Mexico, so taller than a person and getting ready to set its flowers. And this one is even taller than a regular fridge. And here's as we walked around with the class around Naples Island, some of the ones that were used in the landscape and getting ready to flower. So we see the beginning of the flower stalk. And Here's they are. And so we have the flower stalk that will begin to develop. And so the plant is going to grow for many years using the sunlight, gathering resources to make enough energy for a very, very big display of flowers. And so one of the first things that you're going to notice when they are getting ready to flower is that the center leaves will gradually get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so that is going to be the first sign that is going to be ready to flower. And so we have here, the leaves were very large or very wide here. And as it's getting ready to flower, they're going to become a little bit thinner and then thinner and thinner until eventually it's just going to be very small. And the same thing has happened here. So that's going to be the beginning of the flower. And then out of the center, you will have a very large stalk. Depending on the agave, it could reach several meters high or just a couple of feet, depending on the species. But one of the things that you need to understand is that there's going to be two types of flower stalks on an agave. You're going to have the flower stalks that are just going to have a simple stem in the center, and all the flowers are just going to come out of there. And then you're going to have a stalk that is going to branch. So here we have the stalk main, and then there's going to be some branching, and then out of those branches, there's going to be a flower. So those are just going to be two forms, branching or unbranching flower stalks on agaves. And so here's the close-up where you see the branches with the flower buds and the flowers, and on the right, the non-branching one with just hundreds of flowers coming out of that stalk. And so here's the flowers. The flowers are going to be showy because they're going to be produced in very large numbers together. And so when we take the flowers and we analyze it, we're not going to find too many difference to some of the other members of this family. So we're going to have some, the petals, there's usually going to be five. We're going to have the stamens and then the stigma, the style that leads to the ovary towards the bottom. So very simple flower, not too sophisticated. But agaves in Americas do play a major ecological role, and that is because they are going to feed the wildlife. So many agaves have evolved to be pollinated by bats, and that's why the flowers are going to be held very, very high to ensure that the bat's going to find them. Obviously not my photograph, but here's a bat taking the nectar from the agave and getting dusted by the pollen. Or we have the hummingbirds here where as they're hovering, they will be able to pollinate the plant and take the nectar and drink it and feed. And so the flowering of the agaves in the desert is going to coincide with the migration of some of these animals. So hummingbirds will migrate, and when they reach the new area or when they return, they're going to begin to feed, regain their energy by feeding on the nectar of agaves. And so then, after pollination and fertilization comes the fruit of agaves. And once again, the two forms, the ones with a branching stalk and the ones without a branching stalk. And here is just a clump that was allowed to become wild. And there's another very important characteristic of certain agaves, not all of them, and that is that they have the ability to create hundreds upon hundreds of clones of themselves or baby plants. So we see here that the top of the flower spike, if they do not produce the flower, they will then generate baby plants or clones of themselves because that rosette that produces the flower spike is going to die. It may have not been successful in getting a pollinator or getting pollination and fertilization. And so by creating hundreds of babies of itself or clones of itself, some of the babies will land on the ground, they'll root, they'll grow, they'll give the plant another opportunity to get pollinated, get fertilized, and eventually get some seeds into the wild where new individuals that are going to be genetically diverse are going to continue on with the species. So it's an insurance mechanism. It's just another way of surviving by just keep making clones of yourself so that you eventually achieve having a seeds. And so here's some of the uh, individuals that I remove, clean them up. They already have roots, and so they are ready to be planted or they'll naturally attach themselves to the ground. So when you look at agave, there is some special characteristics. And when you look at the back of the leaves, you're going to see a very beautiful imprint of the previous spines or the edge of this leaf that has a very sharp spines. And as the leaves are clasping together, they're going to kind of create an imprint. And that imprint is going to remain throughout the life of the plant. So even when the leaves expand, it's going to have this beautiful imprint. So sometimes this imprint will add to the character of the plant. So here's just a few, and we have some colorful coloration to it. Some of the coloration may also be found on the spines. And so this one happens to have a very nice margin, and the margin has color, so some red, and it also ends on a very sharp spine. And so here's a silver one. And once again, you can see the margin where the leaves used to held or the previous leaf used to be clasping uh, and just left that nice imprint. And or here's some more. So yes, agaves could be quite dangerous because the spines are very sharp and they'll go through trousers and gloves and anything else. And so here's just a few other forms of different agaves showing you the beautiful spines because that's a character. And there's some of them. And even this one that ends at a very sharp spine and a couple more towards the back. And some of them that just have the spine towards the tip. There's nothing else, but you can see the imprint where the old leaf used to be. If you don't want to deal with spines, there are a few that are going to be safer, such as the foxtail agave here being used in the landscape, or for a lot of money, people have been known to spend a lot of money in a variegated form. So this one with a yellow leaves, yellow and green stripes, sought after by many collectors, and here being used in the landscape. And when it flowers, it's going to have a very nice flower display, and then it's going to die. However, you can see towards the bottom that there are baby plants that can replace the old parent or the old rosette. And here's another one that it's what's time for it to flower. Very important, when it starts to flower, do not think that you can stop it from dying by cutting or chopping off the flower stalk. Once the blooming has been initiated, that plant is going to die. And so it's amazing how many times I see it done in the landscape where they see the flowers coming, they chop it off trying to stop it. And it's a waste of a plant because you're not enjoying the flower, you're not enjoying or allowing this plant to carry out its life cycle, and that is that eventually they will flower and they will die. So enjoy the flowers because they do add a lot of character to the landscape when you have a flowering agave. And here's the flowers for this foxtail agave. Agave americana, or the blue agave. So here's some of the old ones that have died. And you can see the rosettes and the babies that came from the roots, because many of the agaves will have the ability to clump. So they do have a rhizome or an underground stem that can eventually send out baby plants from the ground. And so that is what's happening here. They create a thicket or a big clump of agaves, and eventually they will get to age of flowering, and then they'll die, but more babies will be coming out of the ground. So here's a thicket of two different agaves with babies of different stages and sizes, different age. And here's another one, and a few more, and probably the original one was here, and you can see more babies coming from the ground. So make sure that if you're using a clamping agave, that you give it the adequate room. Don't plant it next to the sidewalk where eventually they're going to be a problem. And just here some of the dwarfer or the smaller agaves that are just going to be a couple of inches off the ground, maybe a foot. And it's just going to create a very nice small clump. And we have here one of the commercials applications of agaves. So here is in Oaxaca, where they are being cultivated on the hills here next to agaves. And so this is the tequila agave being in a farm. And so what happens is when those smaller leaves in the center that are triggering the flowering, when the growers see it, then they're going to harvest it. They're going to kill the plant. They're going to chop off the leaves because they don't want to get hurt. And they are going to then generate what is known as an agave heart or pineapple. Kind of looks like a pineapple. So here's the pineapple. Keep in mind that when the plant is getting ready to flower, when you see those young leaves, the plant is going to then change a lot of the starch into sugar. And so they are going to use that extra energy, which is going to be concentrated in the center to produce the flower stalk. And so it is kind of this sugar or the extra sugar that is going to be important for a type of candy. So what happens is that this agaves pineapples are then going to be roasted, and they're going to be roasted where they will then take away some of the extra water, concentrating those sugar to where you have what is known as mezcal. Not the drink. The real mezcal is the base of the agave leaves that you can eat, and it is a very sweet product, and out of this is where they get the agave nectar. And so you have the stem of the agave, and then you have the basis of the leaves. And it's very fibrous, but it's very good, kind of smoky. And so here you can even eat the stem or the center, the base of the leaf, and you can see the burning from when they roasted or toasted this agave. And not only agave, but yuccas and a bunch of other plants were very important for the Native Americans when they came to the Americas and they were venturing through the desert, exploring and colonizing the areas. The agaves played a major role in keeping them alive and feeding them. And there was even rituals of roasting agaves, because once you roast them, if you don't let them get mold, or you don't keep them wet, too wet, they can survive for a while and without refrigeration. And so here's the agave heart or the agave center being sold. And it is a common product now that you may see it in the store. If you never had it, you should try it because it is sweet and it's out there. Or they have drinks. Here, a drink made from the juice of the agave. If you never had it, try it. But that eventually became an alcoholic beverage. So what happens is that in order for them to get some of the water from uh, the agave, when they it starts to flower, they'll cut off the flower, then they'll scrape, cut the leaves, and then scrape the heart. As a response to the injury, the agave is going to release a liquid. Then the people went around with a special uh, device that would extract the liquid. And the liquid mixed with the saliva of the person is going to add the bacteria that will ferment the liquid. Fermenting the liquid then eventually changed some of the sugars into the alcohol. And so it was very early on when they discovered that they could make an alcoholic beverage by fermenting some of the liquid from the agaves. And eventually they made what is known as pulque. Pulque is going to be the more traditional fermented drink that came out of agave, and it has been used by the indigenous people in Central and South America for many, many, many years. Later on, when the Spanish came to America and they brought with them the process to distill. Then the pulque was distilled, or the alcohol was distilled into what we know as tequila. So tequila itself, it is a product from an American plant, but with the technology from the Europeans. And so you have the tequila that you may have the worm, just because that is a pest of the agave, and I guess it just brings extra protein. Or when you just take the mezcal, the toasted agave, roasted agave stalks, and then you squeeze out the liquid that is very sweet, then you get that agave nectar. So if you never had tequila, you may have agave nectar, or it's available out there for the people who might want something sweet but cannot really eat sugar because of diabetes or some other health problems. And so agaves do have a very valuable uh, place in the culture of people. So here's just more in the landscape getting ready to flower. And so the flowers are also going to be important. So here is a very young flower stalk that was also roasted. And in this case, it is being sold for medicinal value. It doesn't really taste good. It was horrible. But they can take the flowers, they can roast them as well. Sorry, the flower stalks, not just the flowers. The flower stalks, they will roast them and they will sell it for medicinal purposes. Here's just a young agaves that are being sold for people to roast, or in more traditional cooking. Sometimes when people are going to be making a roast, they may line the pot or the oven with agave leaves, or to kind of keep the heat in or increase the heat, kind of insulating it. And so the leaves have also a great value. Or the liquid. They extract some of the liquid from the agaves, and people will drink it for medicinal value. It tastes horrible, but I guess it's medicine, so it doesn't need to taste good. And or the agave fibers, that have been used also for many years. They can extract the fibers, so they will take the leaves from the agaves, they'll put them in water or they allow them to rot, and then the bacteria will break the meat from the leaf, leaving behind the stronger fibers. And that's what we have here. The strong fibers that sometimes when they're still attached to the end of that spine, it has a nice needle already with this thread. And so it was very easy for people to use and create clothing. Or one of the more popular things that you may see out there is a product known as pita, which is the fiber made from agave, and it's being used in very expensive decorations. So here is a saddle with pita. And so in the old days, pita was a product of I'm going to say the peasants, but the unwealthy individuals that live in the countryside, so they would make their own pita. And now pita is something that is very, very expensive. So shoes or belts or wallets with pita go for a very high price. But it was the rope, that rope that eventually became important for building things and or mats and a bunch of other things, fishing nets. And so we have different agaves being used in the landscape. Here's some older photographs of agaves that we have here. Here's agaves in the landscape, flowering and getting ready to die, growing higher than the lights. And even in some of the drier areas. So here's Arizona, and I was able to be there. And Fitzer College in Claremont, known for their landscape that is extremely drought tolerant, and you see agaves used in their parking lots, used throughout the landscape, and even next to the parking lots, you see the agaves with some of the other yuccas, more agaves mixed with some of the cacti. And in some of the neighborhoods, we have very large agaves here in the landscape. And we have in the parkway, we have an empty spot in the center. That's probably where the parent plant was planted, that then matured, flower died, and now you have dozens of babies around. So be careful with them, especially some of the more robust individuals, because they can get out of control. Very nice in the parkway. Here's a few of the smaller ones, and even some kind of lining the base of this window. Here's a very nice house with an agave, and agave with bougainvilleas. Yes, they go well together. Agave with the bamboo. Yes, they grow well together. And some of the smaller ones for smaller spaces. Some of the big ones that could be taller than you. Agaves in container. Yes, they make very nice, attractive contemporary plants, and agaves in the wild. So here is Punta Colonet and the coastal native agave shawi. Here's where just laying on the ground with some of the native dahlias. So this is Punta Colonet. So this will be a image of wild California. And here's some more photographs. And here's for scale with the flowers that are quite nice. And just here is in northern Mexico, where we have agave desert tea or the desert agave here just growing on the cliffs. And the gypsum agave from just Botanic Gardens, South Coast Botanic Gardens. So here's just the flowers and some of the more grotesque here. Agave is being used in a very small area. One of the first things that they're always going to do is cut the tips because now the spines are going to hurt people. And that should not be the case. Agave should be given the right space so that they can remain with the tips and not hurt anybody. And you're not going to deface the plant. Here they are in Long Beach, not the ideal plant, but it is being planted. Here's in a hotel in Orange County, mixed with palms, and it could be quite a nice display. And when they're flowering, it could also be very nice. Here at our campus, we have several agaves, and during the right time, this one decided to flower, showing us a great display of flowers. And just here's just more agaves. Yes, they're a great plant for a dry landscape. And so with that, I think is the end. I will thank you kindly and have a great day.